There's a valley in Appalachia where the trees grow too close together, where the fog never quite lifts, and where for over a century, no one from the outside world was allowed to enter. In 1974, a social worker broke that silence. What she found wasn't just poverty. It wasn't just isolation. It was something far darker. A family tree that didn't branch. It circled back on itself again and again, like a noose tightening around its own bloodline. By the time authorities arrived, 3 generations had been born from the same father, and no one, not even the children, could tell you who he was. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. They called it Hollow Creek, though you won't find it on any modern map. It sat wedged between 2 ridges in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, accessible only by a single dirt road that washed out every spring. The nearest town was 14 miles away, and even the locals there didn't talk about the people who lived up in that hollow. They had a name for them, whispered over drinks at the general store, muttered in church parking lots, but no one said it out loud, not where it could be repeated. The family had lived there since before the Civil War. 6, maybe 7 generations, all in the same stretch of land. They didn't go to town, they didn't go to school, they didn't marry outside the hollow, and for over 100 years the rest of the world let them be. It wasn't kindness, it was fear, because everyone who passed near that hollow felt it, the wrongness in the air, the way the birds went silent, the way your skin prickled like you were being watched from the trees. In the summer of 1974, a young social worker named Margaret Hollies was assigned a welfare case in the area. A routine visit, they told her, just check on the family, make sure the children were being fed. She drove up that dirt road on a Tuesday morning, and what she saw in the first 10 minutes made her pull her car over and vomit into the ditch. It wasn't the poverty, though that was extreme. It wasn't the filth, though the smell was unbearable. It was the faces. All of them, grandparents, parents, children, looked the same. The same flat nose, the same wide-set eyes, the same slack jaw. And when she asked the oldest woman present who the father of the youngest child was, the woman smiled with teeth that barely fit her mouth and said, "We all share him." Margaret didn't ask another question. She got back in her car, drove straight to the county office, and demanded they send the police. The sheriff didn't want to go. His name was Dale Pritchard, 53 years old, born and raised in those mountains. He'd heard the stories his whole life. His grandfather had told him never to go up to Hollow Creek, no matter what. Some things the old man had said are meant to stay buried, but Margaret Hollies wouldn't let it go. She filed reports, she called the state, she threatened to go to the newspapers. So on a gray October morning, Sheriff Pritchard, 2 deputies, and a doctor from the county hospital made the drive up that winding road. They brought cameras, they brought medical supplies. What they didn't bring was enough psychological preparation for what they were about to document. The family lived in 3 structures. A main house that was more rotted wood than solid frame, a barn that had been converted into sleeping quarters, and a shed where they kept what little livestock they had. 17 people in total. The oldest was a woman they called Granny, though no one could say for certain how old she was. She might have been 60. She might have been 80. Her skin hung loose on her bones, and her eyes were clouded with cataracts. But she moved through that house like she owned every shadow in it. The youngest was an infant, maybe 4 months old, with a head too large for its body and eyes that didn't track movement. Between them were 15 others, children, teenagers, adults, all bearing the unmistakable signs of severe inbreeding, microphilia, cognitive disabilities, skeletal deformities. Some could barely speak, others couldn't walk without assistance, and they all watched the strangers with the same unblinking stare like animals that had forgotten they were human. The doctor tried to conduct examinations, but the family wouldn't let him touch the children. Granny stood in front of them, arms spread wide, and said in a voice like gravel scraping glass, "You ain't taking what's ours." That's when Sheriff Pritchard noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the wall, scratched into the wood with what looked like a knife, were names, dozens of them, but they repeated. The same 5 or 6 names over and over, spanning what must have been decades, and at the center of it all, carved deeper than the rest, was a single word, father. They tried to make sense of it back at the station. The doctor laid out photographs on the sheriff's desk. Polaroids that would later be sealed in evidence boxes and hidden from the public for nearly 30 years. Children with eyes too far apart, a teenage girl with fingers fused together, a boy maybe 12 whose spine curved so severely he couldn't stand upright. But it was the genealogy that broke them. Margaret had managed to get some of the older children to talk, though their speech was slurred and difficult to understand. She wrote down names, drew lines, tried to construct a family tree. What emerged wasn't a tree at all. It was a knot. Brothers had married sisters, fathers had children with daughters, uncles with nieces, and at the center of it all, going back at least 3 generations, was a pattern so disturbing that the state psychologist they brought in refused to put it in writing. There had been one man, they called him Father, though that wasn't his Christian name, who had fathered children with his own daughters, who then gave birth to more children who he also fathered. The bloodline didn't just fold back on itself. It collapsed inward generation after generation like a star dying in slow motion. But here's what made it worse. Father had been dead for 23 years. Margaret found his grave behind the main house, marked with a stone that had no dates, just that single word carved deep, Father. And yet, when she asked the younger women, girls really some not even 16, who had fathered their children, they all said the same thing. Father did. At first, they thought it was confusion, trauma, an inability to understand the question. But then one of the deputies found something in the barn that changed everything. A room locked from the outside with a bed inside, and on that bed stains that were later confirmed to be biological blood semen. Evidence of ongoing abuse, but the DNA tests they ran didn't match any of the living men in the family. They matched the samples taken from Father's grave, which was impossible unless someone in that hollow had been using his remains, or unless the abuse had been so systematic, so generational that the sons had simply taken their father's place and his name. The state moved quickly once the evidence was compiled. Within 2 weeks, all 17 members of the family were removed from Hollow Creek. The children were placed in foster care. The adults were institutionalized for evaluation. Granny fought them every step of the way. It took 3 officers to get her into the transport vehicle. And even then, she screamed curses in a dialect so old and mangled that no one could fully understand her, but they caught enough. Enough to know she wasn't angry about being taken away. She was angry that the bloodline had been broken. For her, this wasn't abuse. It was tradition. It was survival. It was the only way she knew to keep the family pure. The psychological evaluations painted a picture darker than anyone had anticipated. The adults, those capable of coherent speech, described a world governed by rules that made sense only within the hollow. Outsiders were dangerous. Marriage outside the family was betrayal. And Father, whoever currently held that title, had absolute authority over everybody in the house. The women had no concept of consent. The children had no concept of childhood. One girl, 14 years old, told the psychologist that she'd given birth twice, and both times Granny had taken the baby away within hours. She didn't know where they went. She didn't ask. Asking questions, she said, made Father angry. When pressed about who Father was now, she went silent. Her eyes darted toward the door as if expecting him to walk in. Then she whispered, "He's always been Father, even before he was born." That statement haunted the investigators. It suggested something beyond simple ignorance or indoctrination. It suggested a belief system, a mythology built around the idea that Father was not a man, but a role, a spirit almost that passed from one generation to the next, and whoever held it had the right to do whatever he wanted. They tried to identify which of the men had taken that role after the original father died. DNA tests were conducted, interviews, interrogations. But the results were inconclusive. The genetic material was so intertwined, so recycled that it was impossible to say with certainty who had fathered which child. In some cases, a child could have been the offspring of 3 different men in the family, and all of them would show a paternal match. The family tree had become a genetic mirror, reflecting itself back infinitely. The children never adjusted. That's what the social workers wrote in their reports years later, when they were finally allowed to discuss the case. Most of the younger ones were adopted into families across Kentucky and Tennessee. Their names changed, their histories buried, but they carried the hollow with them. They didn't know how to play. They didn't understand privacy. Some of them hoarded food under their beds, convinced it would be taken away. Others couldn't sleep alone. They'd crawl into closets or under tables, seeking the cramped, dark spaces they'd grown up in. The older children were worse. 2 of them ran away from their foster homes within 6 months and were never found. Authorities suspected they tried to return to Hollow Creek, though the property had been condemned and the structures burned to the ground by court order. Another, a boy named Samuel, was institutionalized after attacking his foster father with a kitchen knife. When asked why, he said the man had touched his sister. He didn't have a sister, not anymore, but in his mind, every girl in the house was his sister, and every man was father. The psychological damage was so profound that an entire team of researchers from the University of Kentucky requested access to the case files. What they found became the basis for a study on generational trauma and isolated population genetics. Though the family's real name was never used, they referred to them only as the Hollow Creek Clan. The study concluded that the level of inbreeding was among the most extreme ever documented in North America. The coefficient of inbreeding, essentially a measure of how genetically similar parents are, was nearly 40% in some of the children. For context, brother-sister pairings result in a coefficient of 25%. These children were more inbred than that. The only way to achieve such numbers was through repeated multi-generational incest involving parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents who were already related. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? But here's the part that still keeps people awake at night. Granny died in the state psychiatric hospital in 1979, 5 years after she was removed from the Hollow. In her final days, she spoke constantly, though most of it was incoherent, but a nurse recorded one conversation. Granny was asked if she regretted anything. She smiled and she said, "Father's still there. He's always there. You can burn the house, but you can't burn the ground." In 1983, A journalist named Colin Marsh tried to write a book about the Hollow Creek case. He'd obtained some of the court documents through a Freedom of Information Act request, interviewed a few of the social workers, even tracked down one of the deputies who'd been there that first day. But halfway through his research, he stopped. He wouldn't say why at first. Then, in a letter to his editor, he admitted something that made his publisher pull the project entirely. He'd driven up to where Hollow Creek had been. The road was still there, overgrown but passable. The foundations of the buildings were still visible, charred and crumbling. And while he was standing there taking notes, he heard singing, a woman's voice, high and thin, carrying through the trees. He followed it. Half a mile into the woods, he found a clearing, and in the center of that clearing was a grave, fresh. The dirt was dark and loose, the kind that hadn't settled yet. There was no marker, but scratched into a nearby tree, deep enough to scar the wood. Was that word again? Father, Colin left immediately. He didn't take pictures. He didn't call the police. He just got in his car and drove back to Lexington, and he never went back. When asked why he didn't report it, he said, "Because I don't think it was meant for the police. I think it was meant for me, a warning no investigation was ever conducted. Nobody was ever exhumed. Officially, Hollow Creek is empty, abandoned. A footnote in Appalachian history. But locals will tell you different. They'll tell you that people still see lights up in those hills at night. Campfires maybe, or lanterns. They'll tell you that hunters who wander too close come back different, quiet, confused. Some of them don't come back at all. And there's one story whispered in the bars around that county that a few years ago, a hiker found a shack deep in the woods near where the hollow used to be. Inside were blankets, canned food, and carved into the wall over and over in handwriting that looked like a child's were the words, "Father is home." The state denies it. The Forestry Service has no record of it, but the hiker's name was logged in a missing persons report 6 months later. He told his girlfriend he was going back to prove it wasn't real. She never saw him again. The last of the Hollow Creek children, the ones who survived, the ones who were placed in homes and given new lives, are in their 50s now. Most of them refuse to talk about where they came from. A few have died. Suicides, mostly overdoses. One drove his car into a lake in 2003 with a note on the passenger seat that said, "Only I can still hear him calling." But there's one, a woman named Emily, though that's not the name she was born with. She agreed to speak to a documentary crew in 2019, on the condition that her face wasn't shown and her voice was disguised. What she said on camera has never been fully released. The footage was deemed too disturbing, but portions of the transcript leaked online. She described growing up in the hollow, the way the days blurred together, the way Granny would hum while she cooked, the same melody over and over like a lie, meant to keep you asleep even when your eyes were open. She described the room in the barn, the smell of it, the sound of the lock clicking shut from the outside. And she described Father, not the original one, not the man in the grave, but the one who came after. She said he wore a mask, not a real mask, but something made from cloth and mud tied around his face so you could only see his eyes. And those eyes, she said, were empty, like looking into a well with no bottom. She said the worst part wasn't what he did. It was that she'd stopped feeling it after a while, stopped feeling anything, like her body had learned to go somewhere else, somewhere far away while it happened. And when it was over, Granny would wash her in cold water from the creek and tell her she'd done good, that Father was pleased that the family would continue. Emily was 11 years old the day the police came. She said she didn't feel relieved. She felt terror because leaving meant the world outside, and the world outside didn't have rules. In the hollow, you knew what to expect out here. She said nothing made sense. She spent the last 40 years trying to build a normal life. She has a job, a small apartment, no children. She says she made that decision early. She couldn't risk it. Couldn't risk passing on whatever was inside her. And at night when she closes her eyes, she still hears it. That humming, that melody Granny used to sing. She doesn't know the words, but she knows what it means. It means Father is waiting, not in the hollow, not in the grave, but in the blood, in the bones, in the part of her that will never leave those mountains. No matter how far she runs, the state of Kentucky sealed the case files in 1985. They'll remain sealed until 75 years of silence mandated by law. By then, everyone involved will be dead. The children, the investigators, the people who saw what happened up in that hollow and carried it with them for the rest of their lives. But the land is still there. The trees, the fog, the dirt where the house once stood. And if you go up there, if you're brave enough or foolish enough to walk that old road, you'll feel it. That wrongness in the air, that weight pressing down on your chest. And if you're quiet, if you stand very still and listen, you might hear it too. The singing, faint, distant, a woman's voice, high and thin, carrying through the trees, calling you deeper, calling you home. Some stories don't end, they just stop being told. This is one of them. If this video disturbed you, if it made you think, leave a comment below. Tell us what's the darkest family secret you've ever heard. And if you want more stories like this, stories the world tried to forget, make sure you're subscribed because there are more hollows out there, more secrets buried in the hills, and we're just getting started.